So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar on the FIFA World Cup 2026. What we're going to be covering today, we're going to look at the regional risk landscape of each of the host nations. We're going to have a look at the potential relationship between the current conflict in the Middle East and the tournament, and then go into detail into executive and VIP strategy, some of the intelligence gathering and emerging threats. And as ever, we do have time for Q questions at the end. So if you do have a question, please pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. A recording of this webinar will also be available once we have finished. So joining me today, we have Sean Archer, who's the global lead for event risk, travel risk, and crisis management at Adidas. We have Luke Westgar-Taylor, Global Director of Healix On Demand Services, and we have Spencer Haslam, Regional Security Coordinator at Healix and also our FIFA World Cup Content Lead. Julie Jones was meant to be with us today, but unfortunately she is unwell, so we wish her a speedy recovery. And I'm Andrew Devereux, Global Risk Intelligence Manager at Healix. So as a starter for 10, Spencer, could you give us an overview of the risk environments across Canada, the US, and Mexico, and the location-specific risks that organizations should be aware of in each?
Certainly, Andrew. Thank you. As we know, there are all sorts of kind of general risks that come with major sporting events like this. But with this World Cup being in 3 countries with 3 very different risk environments, I thought it was particularly useful for watchers to be able to see kind of the main differences between the 3 countries. In the United States, we have this most recent one at the top there, and that's the ICE activity and the associated protests that come along with that. As a disclaimer, we don't exactly know what ICE's role at the World Cup will be. The government has been very vague on this. And there's a chance that, we won't truly know until the first day of the tournament. But what I can tell you is that, as we've seen with the airports in the last week, with ICE being deployed there, it certainly can't be ruled out that they will be on the ground in some sort of security oversight role. As a result of that, we can expect heightened risk of counter protests if Democrat groups and left-leaning activist groups are aware of this. And as a result, that brings an elevated risk of clashes. The second one is that with the United States hosting the majority of games at this tournament, the risk of fan violence there is particularly latent compared to the other 2 countries. This is especially true because the US is hosting something like 90% of the knockout stage games, where they will be the most attended, the most high profile, and generally the most likely to escalate into some sort of fan violence or clashes outside the stadium. I'd be remiss to not mention the geopolitical tensions that kind of surround the backdrop of this tournament with regards to the United States, what's going on in the Middle East. There's obviously questions about Iran's participation at the World Cup. They've qualified, but rhetoric from their government has indicated that there's a very credible chance that they won't participate. And on top of that, the relationship between the United States and several countries in Latin America and Africa and Asia that are under some form of travel ban by the Trump administration. So, obviously there are always geopolitical factors at play during sporting events, but I think this World Cup, they are at as close to the forefront as they've ever been. And that's something that the industry will definitely have to navigate and watch out for, particularly with countries with sort of a poor relationship with the United States on that front. And lastly, on a more operational perspective, a lot of the host cities in the US, they have very limited public transport. They have stadiums that are very far away from the city center. So that kind of underscores the importance of having your own transport, but also taking into account the elevated risks of delays. And as I mentioned before, we've seen in the last week that airports in the United States, the lines for security and for transit have become particularly extensive So being prepared for travel disruption, that is a particularly a latent risk for the United States. Moving on to Mexico, as always with the kind of general Mexican security environment, the risks of petty crime and scams and express kidnapping, which if you're unfamiliar, that's where you're basically led to an ATM by the perpetrator. They'll force you to withdraw some money from your bank account and then they will let you go. These are three kind of incidents that are significantly higher risk in Mexico across all three host cities. This is less of a tournament specific risk and more of something you need to generally keep an eye out for Mexico, but nonetheless, still something very prevalent that travelers should keep an eye out for. In terms of protests in Mexico are more likely to be explicitly anti-World Cup. There's a lot of sentiment in the host cities that the government has invested money in hosting the World Cup and renovating stadiums that they would say would be better allocated elsewhere. As a result, you have an elevated risk of anti-government protests, not only outside stadiums, but in city centers as well. And this last point here, this mainly applies to Guadalajara, but I'm sure as a lot of people are aware, there was the wave of cartel violence that hit Guadalajara and much of Western Mexico a few weeks ago. Our assessment is that this is unlikely to occur during the World Cup because of the heightened security that the Mexican authorities have put in place. But it does remind us that, an escalation in cartel violence in Mexico can never be ruled out and is something that should be prepared for. Lastly, Canada, probably the most permissive security environment of the three host countries, but from an operational perspective, some things to keep an eye out are disproportionate levels of travel disruption. I can tell you as a Vancouver native, we are expecting this city to go to a complete standstill during the tournament. You see that map in the corner there with all the road closures in the city center. So not only for World Cup travelers, but anybody traveling to Vancouver on business or any organizations based in Vancouver, these are the kind of things that you need to keep an eye out for when you're planning. And then as well, we've seen major demand surges for transportation, with flight tickets, et cetera, as well as accommodation and medical facilities. Doctors and medical associations have already pointed out that the demand surge on Canada's hospitals is expected to be significant during the tournament. We've seen in BC and in Ontario that elective surgeries have been postponed during the World Cup due to the lack of capacity to handle the surge in travelers as well as those elective surgeries. So as much as there are petty crime risks that go up no matter where the tournament is, these are kind of the main risks for each of the three countries that are unique.
Yeah, obviously three differing risk environments there, covering everything from cartel violence to buses being a bit busier than usual. And one thing you mentioned right at the start there, that talking anecdotally to people seems to be at the top of everyone's list, is the ICE dimension, because that's still a bit of an unknown at the moment. And that's clearly a concern for many industries and organizations who have people who are going to be traveling to the World Cup. So moving on to the macro trends that could shape the threat landscape of the tournament. So talking about trends that impact football tournaments historically, fan violence is the main thing that comes to mind, as you've already mentioned. And are there any specific risks that we can expect to see at the 2026 World Cup that we perhaps haven't seen previously?
Yeah, one thing I would point out is that the last two World Cups in Qatar and Russia, obviously those are places where travelers from most countries would kind of go out of their way to be on their best behavior. You don't really want to mess around and end up in a Russian jail cell. The logic is that maybe coming to the United States, coming to Canada, even Mexico, that fans' vigilance and their kind of ability to be on their best behavior, it might not be as high because that fear factor with the host nation's authorities and their justice system isn't there. As you mentioned, fan violence, that's kind of the main football tournament specific risk. So we've just got here some simple tips as to how to spot it, where it's likely to be, and how to avoid it. So in terms of where, this is something that generally occurs in the city center. You have your main squares, your parks, and entertainment districts. These are kind of large spaces where thousands and thousands of fans can gather before a match. I appreciate that can be very disruptive for businesses who operate in these areas. So that's definitely something to keep an eye out, whether you're planning meetings or you're planning working from home. As far as the who, I have ultras there. If you're not familiar with ultras, these are sort of the most diehard group of fans. They're more common in club football, but in a lot of countries on the international level, they will be there as well. Particularly for Eastern Europe, Northern Africa, and Latin America. Again, 99.9% of fans coming to this World Cup are law-abiding citizens and aren't going to cause any problems. But as you see from that picture of England fans in Marseille in Euro 2016, it takes a very small minority to have a few too many drinks, start throwing projectiles, and then next thing you know, you're in a scenario where the city center is affected by clashes. As far as how to avoid fan violence and any of these clashes, it's actually quite straightforward. First off, identifying what fixtures are going to be high risk. The main indicators for that is two large fan bases. I mentioned before, Eastern Europe, North Africa, Latin America. Those are kind of matches between countries from those two regions, is something to look out for. Any kind of prior history of fan violence. We have some countries that are particularly, unlikely to be implicated in this. And then any kind of socio-political tension. This is something that comes into play more in the knockout stages when you have bordering European countries or bordering South American countries playing each other. And then the last point is keeping an eye out for evening kickoffs. If you watch football in England at all, you'll know that a lot of rivalry matches are scheduled for a noon kickoff because that gives the fans less time to get out in the town and drink and have the tensions rise slowly and slowly. So if you're looking at like a 6 p.m. or a 9 p.m. kickoff, that's something where the risk is highest. As far as actual mitigation measures, if you can plan travel to bypass those flashpoint areas, I would recommend that. Even from a travel disruption perspective, if you have 20,000 fans in the main square of your city, it's worth it to bypass it just to avoid getting mixed up in that. Keep an eye out on local news, but also sporting news sources. A lot of sports outlets have become increasingly extensive on their reporting on kind of the intersection between sporting events and security. So definitely keep an eye out for those. They'll have, generally pretty fast articles on that. This is standard advice for any protest you come across, but if you do see clashes start, leave the area as soon as it's safe to do so. Again, our standard advice applies. Leave at a 90-degree angle. Don't move towards any police or any kind of security forces. And then the last point is after matches, make sure that you're exercising heightened vigilance. We saw a couple months ago at the African Cup of Nations final, very contentious ending, and that resulted in significant violence between Moroccan and Senegalese fans, not only in the stadium, but outside the stadium and in other areas of Morocco as well. So, whether that's a late penalty or a controversial call, whatever it may be, make sure that when you're leaving a match, you have your wits about you so you can avoid any kind of post-match scuffles if they do occur.
Thank you, Spencer. I noted down there that you listed out a bunch of regions where ultras are most likely to be from and still used a picture of England fans. And also well done to referring to it as football. I imagine that was quite challenging for you. So just finally from you, Spencer, what are some of the things that organizations can do and implement to try and mitigate some of the risks that you've covered?
Sure. Yeah, we've summed it up in kind of 6 questions for security managers to ask themselves. This first one, organization profile. As much as we talk about traveling to North America for the World Cup, there are plenty of organizations obviously based here, and the measures they're going to need to take are very different from organizations who have personnel traveling here. So that's the first split right off the bat, because you know, if you're in North America, you need to keep business as usual going. And that's going to take a different set of planning than if you're sending employees on business travel. As far as purpose of travel is concerned, I appreciate that maybe we have clients who just are coming to North America for meetings and they happen to be during the World Cup. Bridging that awareness gap is something that's very crucial for that. But as far as, you know, stadium specific risks and fan violence risks, that's less pertinent to you. Traveler stature, we'll get into the importance of protecting your C-suite later on in the webinar, but obviously you want additional measures if you have any C-suite or high profile members attending matches at the tournament. Tournament timeline, this is kind of an underrated aspect of this, but if you're coming during the group stages versus the knockout stages, that does make a difference. Knockout stage matches are probably going to be have a higher attendance, they'll have a higher security posture, and also, you know, there's the tournament goes on until I think it's 5 weeks long, but some of the cities are only hosting matches for a period of about 3 weeks. So you could be going to Monterrey or Guadalajara while the semifinals are on, but they won't have hosted a match for a week. So even simple things like that, like looking at the match schedule, can help you best tailor your protocols. As far as city-specific risks go, this is particularly pertinent for the United States, but you have Seattle and Los Angeles and New York, which are more Democrat-leaning cities and where kind of anti-Trump protests are more likely to occur. So you'll need to tailor your itineraries to that, whereas other venues like Philadelphia and Atlanta and Miami, that's where the crime risks are a little bit more pertinent. So kind of make sure you're going down to a city-specific granular level when you're planning travel, so you know which risks are the most prevalent. And then lastly, stadium location in the United States. This might be a foreign concept to the Europeans here. The stadiums can be very far away from the city center. The worst example of this is in San Francisco. I think it's 55 kilometers away from downtown San Francisco. If you overlay that on London, that would be outside of the M25. So, you know, FIFA likes to refer as Los Angeles and Dallas, but, you know, really it's in Inglewood and Arlington. And you have to take into account that these are suburbs with very different security environments and, you know, sometimes very poor transit connectivity. So that's probably the sixth factor that you would want to take in when you're planning your travel.
Thank you very much, Spencer. Really interesting stuff. I hadn't realized quite how far away the stadiums are from the host cities, if you see what I mean. So we're going to move on now, and you don't need to adjust your TV sets. We only have slides for the first section, so we're now just going to be talking heads. We're just going to move on to a brief section on the current conflict in the Middle East and any potential impact on the World Cup. We were asked this question on a webinar we held yesterday on the Middle East. That is available if anyone wants to see it. So we thought we'd just quickly cover it here today as well. I think the main headline is practically for attendees and organizations, there's unlikely to be associated disruption or impact because of the current conflict in the Middle East. It is fairly unique, however. It is the first time a World Cup host nation has been directly at war with a participating country. So it's not unusual that this is getting so much attention. There are obviously high-level issues, as Spencer mentioned, such as Iran playing its scheduled fixtures. I mean, they're scheduled to play at Los Angeles and Seattle. If those games went ahead, there would be increased risks surrounding these games owing to the risk of confrontations, protests, and unrest. It's yet to be confirmed what's going to happen with these fixtures, but at this stage, it would appear pretty unlikely that Iran are going to participate. There are issues with players potentially being used as pawns in the geopolitical game, and there's issues with potentially traveling fans obtaining visas and being targeted. So the lack of security guarantees for both players and fans mean this is likely going to be the trigger for Iran not competing at this tournament. But as I say, this is not definite. The Iranian government has made noises about potentially moving the fixtures to either Mexico or Canada, but FIFA has stated it is unwilling to do so at this stage. So it's not a definite they're not going to participate, but it seems likely. I think it should also be said that the FIFA World Cup is no stranger to geopolitical controversy. All we need to do is look at its recent history. So, for instance, the last edition was held in Qatar, as Spencer mentioned. That drew concerns over human rights violations due to worker deaths while preparing for the tournament and restrictions on freedom of expression. But the tournament still went ahead with minimal disruption. And before that, it was held in Russia, which at that point had annexed Crimea. So, whilst it wasn't quite at the level of international isolation that we're currently experiencing, there were still concerns there. As mentioned, both tournaments went ahead with fairly minimal disruption or associated issues with in the geopolitical realm. It was the on-ground practicalities such as temperature, especially in Qatar, alcohol consumption, and fan violence, which were the more pervasive issues, which Spencer has already covered off. So, in summary, are other teams likely to boycott the World Cup? No, I think that's highly unlikely. Are fans likely to boycott the World Cup because of the conflict? Again, no, I don't think so. As mentioned, the primary risks aren't the more sort of macro level geopolitical risks, but the more specific risks that Spencer's already mentioned. We obviously can't account at this stage for any unprecedented escalations or developments in that conflict, but on the current trajectory, the tournament should be held with minimal interruptions related to the current conflict. And just to end on this note, I think it is also slightly ironic that we're talking about this as a potential risk today when FIFA created the inaugural FIFA Peace Prize a few months ago and awarded this to President Trump in January 2026. So that's a quick summary on the potential relationship between the current conflict in the Middle East and the World Cup. So we will now move on to executive and VIP strategy with Luke and Sean. So moving on to the operational details of designing executive protection for a high visibility, high football event such as this, what are some of the more foundational assumptions security leaders need to be challenging, and what are some of the basics that need to be established prior to the task?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that, Andrew. Thank you very much. I think the way Healix approaches the methodology for this type of thing is we maintain that we're an Intel-led security division within the company, and remaining intelligence-led is the key focus here. So gathering as much information as you can, verifying your sources, and corroborating that into intelligence, and really front-loading the intelligence gathering and approach to what is relevant for your organization or your travelers or you as an individual going into this World Cup. So I would say that if you look at the profile of your attendees, potentially looking at giving them some training to be their own first responder, or at least understand the nature of security and the environment, relevant training specific to the very different locations, as Spencer covered off, doing open source intelligence vulnerability assessments on those individuals. How at risk are those individuals of going into these locations? How well known are they? What is their public profile? And really matching a sort of balance between international best practice and your company or your organization or your personal risk profile or risk appetite, and how well known you are. If you're seen in the streets, Spencer spoke about a C-suite individual going, they're not going to have an elevated risk based on public perceptions, whereas Sean, some of the attendees you might be hosting are going to have public profile and public facing figures that are going to come with elevated risk. So I'd be interested to see how you match that, Sean, on your side in terms of keeping a low profile approach. But very much looking at a phased approach on what is necessary, right? So do you need security trained drivers? Do you need close protection officers? Do you need teams? Do you want to keep a low profile? Do you want to elevate the profile because they're a high profile individual anyway, so they're going to stand out? So, you need to mitigate the risks accordingly. When looking at the threats and risks that exist in these environments, Spencer gave a good summary of these. you do have the fan violence that can happen anywhere. You do have high traffic congestion. So where are you placing your people in terms of hotel or accommodation? What is the security in those locations? What are the routes between the venues? How accessible are evacuation options in the case of a deterioration? And all of these need to be taken into account to frame what is reasonable to put in place. I would also say that with Mexico, obviously, Spencer gave a good summary of the specific risks that do exist. So when we look at security risk at Healix, we look at multiple sub-risk factors, and Mexico is high on quite a few of those indicators, obviously low on others, but you do have the risk of petty crime. You do have the risk of express kidnappings. You've got the risk of virtual kidnappings. You've also got the risk of scams, but you also have the mitigation of if you're not a Spanish speaker, you're less at risk because they can't communicate with you. So, probably a mitigation in itself. But things like dating apps and online scams, etc., drawing you to locations to express kidnap, hold you until your daily limit resets and draw it out again, etc. And then there's obviously the latent risk, as Spencer said, on the cartel violence. And when we're looking at cartel violence, it's as latent as it may be, it's a significant risk in itself in that it escalates quickly into violence. They have very low value for life, etc. So if you do get caught up in a violent escalation or a kidnap for ransom or express kidnapping situation, something you really need to focus in mitigating against, because the the reverse side of it is poor. Sean, anything to add on that?
I think for us, an assumption that we always try to negate is that people know what they're doing. I think what's been key to us is the boots on the ground are pivotal to resolving the issue on the ground, but behind that requires a lot of decision making and escalation. And for us, it's imperative that the decision makers are briefed and the escalation processes are very well refined. So we rely heavily on tabletop exercises that before every event to make sure that those that would sit within a crisis management team know what their roles and responsibilities are before the event, so that any response that we may need to make is very well practiced. Additionally to that, you referenced there that we often have VIPs and athletes attend some of our events, given the nature of the business that we are. They as well have external security guards and CPOs, and it's an assumption that our teams and their teams will work perfectly together. So we try and navigate that assumption and make sure that the correct introductions are done early on. Everybody is singing off the same hymn sheet, and the decision making processes are all very aligned and smooth if anything needs to happen. I think another thing that I'd like to add is sometimes a challenge that we often make is that one size doesn't fit all, and I think that's especially prevalent for this World Cup. And I think the one to follow in 2030 in Spain, Morocco, and Portugal. We've got 3 countries on in this particular tournament, the first of its kind, with 3 very different landscapes. And it's imperative that every event, every match is reviewed with the intelligence that you referenced, Luke, and we know the granular detail to amend our approaches as is needed, just to make sure that any blind spots are identified and actioned as soon as it can be.
Sure. One of the points you made there, which was assume people don't know what they're doing. I think that's a really interesting point, because one aspect to remember about this sort of event is that it's an exciting event that people will be excited to go to. As soon as you land and you get caught up in the actual event itself, that's when what people have been taught, suddenly they're into that sort of region of complacency and they've forgotten it all. So is there ever an issue with trying to communicate the risks to those on the ground to make sure they actually that they're hammered home slightly, to make sure that if something does happen, that they're actually keeping in the back of their mind that this is a fairly foreign risk environment and landscape that they need to be aware of?
I think complacency is a really good word to describe it. And obviously you step inside the footprint of a stadium, and as Spencer referenced, there's some of these stadiums sit well outside of the city limits. But I think complacency is a really good word to describe it. on your access and egress from that stadium, the risks are enhanced. And I think what we're improving on as an organisation is messaging to guests and colleagues. We don't want to overload them with risks, because we understand that when you do that, a lot of the risks are overlooked and people don't perhaps review the detail within it. But what we try and do is very carefully educate people on how to obtain support from people like Healix if they're supporting us, or other kind of subject matter experts. How, if I'm in trouble at a football game, or I'm not sure, or something doesn't feel right, how and who do I call? And that's something that we're really working on. And that's something that we've improved on over the last couple of major events.
Sure, thank you very much. And the point was made also earlier, because obviously fan violence is a theme that's going to come up a lot in this webinar. I think it already has. Like that, obviously fan violence can happen anywhere, but there is still an element of almost on-ground common sense practicalities that people can kind of implement. If you're in a central square where there are numerous bars, there's people spilling out into the street, there are fans of opposing team there, then there should be something there. There is a signal, there's an indicator of this current environment at this time as heightened risk, and I just need to be aware of that. It's not a definite that something is going to happen, but it should be a signal enough to sort of think, if I were to leave here relatively quickly because something was to escalate, where would I go? So I think that's an important point. And we covered quite a lot there, but what would you say is the sort of single most important operational decision organizations must make before their people land in one of the host cities?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that because Sean referenced it, right? I think it's, this gets pulled apart a lot, but we see it regularly. Clients that have decent contingency plans with travelers that are familiar with those plans, that are trained on the situational awareness of the specific risks of the environment and the familiarization thereof. I think contingency planning that is tested and that is trained and familiarity amongst the traveler base is essential. I think that would be the biggest thing for me is contingency plan, not so much on the executive protection side of things, but very much on the everyone should have a heightened situational awareness. Everyone should be trained on it. Everyone should be trained on the threats and risks that exist and how to mitigate them. And if something does go wrong, how do they react?
Just to jump in there, sort of, you said you need a tested and planned contingency plan. How can you test that before you're actually on the ground, if you see what I mean?
So, I mean, you can run scenarios as the traveler base going. You can run scenarios, whether that's tabletop, desktop, workshop, or practical scenarios. And then from a remote perspective, most organizations would have as we did last year, we did an assessment on how prepared organizations felt in a crisis. So how prepared do you feel as an organization to face those threats and risks from a low-level incident escalating into emergency all the way up to a full-blown crisis? How is your crisis management team standing up, recognizing, reporting, aligning, and handling a crisis or emergency?
Sure. Sean, do you want to add anything on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, just emphasizing the importance of tabletop exercises. I mean, we run a number before every major event with our core team, and that core team consists of security experts, non-security experts, external, internal, and we're all around the same table. We're all thrashing it out and we're all sense checking ideas. And once that core team is aligned and the process is simple and it's ingrained with them, everything else falls into place. If you can smooth out the alignment process post incident, the panic is a lot less. I mean, we will have probably north of 10,000 people from our organization and guests of our organization traveling to the Mexico, the States, and Canada. It's difficult to contact all of them with a necessary brief. We equip them with the basics, but when it comes to the core team that are on the ground, tabletop exercises have been imperative to us for getting the messaging across effectively.
Absolutely. Thank you both. We're just going to move on now to, as Luke mentioned there, the importance of being an intelligence-led team. So we're just going to cover off a bit on intelligence gathering and emerging threats. So with that in mind, Spencer, what types of intelligence systems, platforms, or methods have proven most valuable for tracking emerging risks, both before and during sort of major global events that can have a real impact on the decision making of the team on the ground?
Yeah, for sure. I'll start with the disclaimer that if you have the resourcing and you have the capability, social media can be, in a limited capacity, it can be effective. Obviously, with something like the World Cup, with hundreds of millions of viewers, you do not want to be on X just sifting through tweet after tweet after tweet. Especially with all the burner accounts they have on there. But if you do have the capacity for that, social media is definitely useful in terms of the speed at which it can put out intelligence compared to conventional media. What I would highly recommend is if your organization can get in touch with some sort of aggregator platform. We have one that's very helpful as kind of an initial kind of sifting of information. A lot of times it'll be able to decipher whether that's somebody that's on the ground that's posting about it, or again, some burner account with no profile picture. Another thing that I would point out, and I'll name drop here real quick, but I did go to an event ran by the State Department where FIFA's head of intelligence did a presentation at. And one thing that is different with this tournament compared to past World Cups is that FIFA have centralized the intelligence gathering process. In Qatar and Russia, and indeed in World Cups before that, that was something that sat with the host country's authorities. And a lot of times they would be more focused on terrorism, they would be more focused on crime, whereas now that responsibility still sits with the federal authorities, obviously, but FIFA has a ring-fenced team, and their main job is to look into football intelligence. They're tracking WhatsApp and Signal and sort of more niche platforms to figure out if ultras are planning any premeditated violence or any kind of marches that would be particularly disruptive. So as far as actually using FIFA as a source, I would highly recommend that, because this edition of the tournament, they've dedicated significant resources to this. And again, that's straight coming from the ground from them. So that's definitely a viable option. Like I said, social media, there's so much noise on it that you really have to take everything with a grain of salt on there. Especially with, and we've talked about this in Middle East webinars, we've talked about this for all sorts of other events. Misinformation and disinformation is very rife. So being able to, either via an aggregator or trying to use FIFA's content themselves, being able to go direct to source and do that is something that's crucial.
So FIFA said that information is going to be publicly available and shared. Is it via either socials or a sort of central hub or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I've connected with them on LinkedIn, and if you're a security manager, I would highly suggest doing the same, just because you'll have faster access and you'll have better access. But that's something that's also going to help them coordinate with authorities on the ground, so that any threats that they see arise, there can be a faster response to it.
Excellent. I didn't know that. So that's actually very interesting that FIFA are going down that sort of more centralized route. And just secondly, you mentioned it there. Social media is both a blessing and a curse when it comes to this sort of event, because trying to separate the signal from the noise is incredibly difficult. There will undoubtedly be social media traffic surges. Misinformation and disinformation is rife and only really increasing in the sort of spaces on social media. When decisions need to be made rapidly, sometimes on unverifiable or unverified information that's coming from these sources, what is the best way to approach that?
I would stress the importance of implementing proactivity in your protocols for these kind of things. A lot of the types of incidents that would occur that kind of falls under the umbrella of that question, these are things that we can anticipate potentially happening. So obviously Luke and Sean have talked about workshops and tabletop exercises. Another layer to that is being able to ensure that not only your security managers but also your employees are able to, if they're getting information rapidly from an unverified source, how they can have the decision-making process to, determine whether there's a heightened risk to themselves, and make decisions from there. I will say that like the Copa America final in Miami, where there was thousands of ticketless fans. They breached the security perimeter and tried to get into the stadium. That was very eye-opening for American authorities, because they realized that not only their security measures were not extensive enough, but also their dissemination of information wasn't quick enough. So normally sometimes people might have the preconception that if they hear something immediately after a crisis, then it's either overblown or it's incorrect. But in this case, I would, if you're at a stadium and you hear something from authorities or media or what have you, don't necessarily stress so much about how fast it's come. Stress about what your response is going to be to it and how you can get out of there safely. Because like I said, between the FIFA intelligence team and between the level of security and coordination that there's going to be within authorities, we can expect information to be circulated much more rapidly than it has been in previous tournaments.
Thank you, Spencer. And one thing you mentioned there, which I think is really interesting, you mentioned the Copa America final in Miami. Previously, you've mentioned the recent AFCON final in Morocco, and even at the Euros final, which was held in London, there was issues with fan behavior at all three of those finals, which shows that these risks are real. And two of those finals, one was held in the UK, one was held in the US. So these are real risks. There are on-ground realities that fan behavior can pose a risk to those in the area. This is not just something abstract and conceptual we're talking about. And in terms of those on-the-ground realities and the operational challenges, coming back to you, Luke and Sean. So the oft-quoted comment from Mike Tyson is, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. How do you balance ensuring that you have an actionable plan that is flexible enough to change to the dynamic on-ground situations that can rapidly escalate in this sort of event?
Yeah, I mean, we see it all the time, and as you say, everyone does have a plan till they get punched in the face, or no plan survives contact with the enemy. But we see it all the time, right? We look at the recent escalations in the Middle East with all the evacuations, etc. Look at as far back as Ukraine, Sudan conflict, etc. It was far easier to help people in those situations when they had a plan to work from, because it's a single point of information. It's got where they're based, what their operations are, what their activities are, what the transport options are, and what the evacuation options and escalation options are. Shelter in place advice is already built in, so they can be self-sufficient relatively. We hopefully have a manifest. We understand what visas and passports people have, so we can start looking at options that may not have existed on the front end. And our favorite options, secondary, tertiary, wildcard options, may no longer be feasible, but it allows us to think about what other options may exist. So I think a robust plan that is tested at least enables people to react. It is that self-reliance tool. I labor the point on familiarity with that plan, because a plan is not just a tick in the box. If everyone's familiar with that plan, they know how to be their first responder initially. The crisis team or emergency response team know how to react immediately. We know how to stand the team up. We know how to communicate. We know how to communicate internally within the organization to the travelers, externally, etc. And you've got a single point of reference to start from. Whether that plan goes out the window, at least you've got some information to draw from.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I think from my side, an alignment plan is crucial, and having a very small kind of hand-selected core team of decision makers is really imperative. Yeah. And it's proved, it provided dividends for us in previous incidents. You mentioned a 2021 Euro final in Wembley, a world-renowned global stadium, and something happened there which was unplanned. we can never plan for that. But I think what's proved really important to us is having a core team of people that can make decisions quickly, know who to signpost, and identify a single ultimate decision maker really that can call a showstopper, call significant amendments to the program. That core team is really, really useful. I think from a large organization like myself, there's lots of moving parts and there's lots of people in play, and comms can often get confusing, decisions can get lost. And if you have that core team, it really, really helps you make decisions quick and action events almost immediately.
Yeah, and I suppose that's so important for an event like this where there's so many critical dependencies that can fail. So just before we move on, I don't know if you have any comment you want to make on resiliency in these sort of plans, because obviously that's a word that comes up a lot when in these sort of discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that a little bit, right? And again, it comes down to stress testing, training, tabletop exercises. How quickly can you ring fence your team and get them in a room to discuss? What are your reporting guidelines in terms of, do you build a face sheet? How do you take down that information? How do you report that up to your executives that need to be accountable for the decisions that are being made, etc.? And how quickly can that all happen? I think if you can get into that scramble phase as fast as possible and get out of it as fast as possible, I think you're in a particularly good place.
Sure. And in this case, as you said, getting in and out of the scramble phase is important, but the scramble phase in itself shouldn't be viewed as a bad thing. It's an important aspect to be able to get through it and into a slightly calmer and better phase. Yeah. And so moving on slightly to sort of crisis preparedness and scenario planning. So coming back to you, Spencer, in terms of crisis preparedness, what can organizations do to set themselves to respond to a crisis, an incident, a development which both enables fast decision making, which has been referred to a lot throughout this webinar as crucial, whilst also having the on-ground mitigations?
Yeah, I think from a pre-event planning perspective, I think Luke and Sean have nailed it in terms of having a small group of decision makers, but also ensure that you're building resilience in your individual travelers, and you're giving them the ability to make fast decisions on the ground. One thing I would stress is that the World Cup and all of its security risks and operational risks, it's not static. It's going to change as the tournament progresses. And that kind of brings to the forefront the importance of, staying on top of the event. I know that, we've done event monitoring for clients for several sporting events. Our intelligence team does a great job of that. And certainly myself, I will definitely be tracking the tournament closely. You'll notice I've referenced 2 major footballing finals, and Sean's referenced another one. There is a lot of, as much as we talk about, unplanned events, there is a lot of precedent in football that helps us plan, and that helps us kind of have an idea of what the worst case scenario is. So, just making sure that the first week, especially, I would say, really have a close eye on what the security measures are like at stadiums, what kind of delays you're seeing in the transportation system, and then being able to adapt and tailor as the tournament progresses and as the games get more high profile and as the security posture gets heightened. This isn't something that you want to, put hours and hours of planning into, and then on June 11th, sit back and say, all right, tournament's here, not going to change anything. So I would really emphasize the point of, the entire length of the tournament, continuing to look at the on-the-ground reality and continuing to evolve your security plans and your security posture from there.
Absolutely, you make a good point there. We'll mention it again. Complacency, just because all of the group stage games go off without any issues, does not mean that the rest of the tournament is going to stay on that same sort of tempo of stability. I think that's a really important point. And just as a sort of final question to each of you before we move on to the Q&A section, In terms of the future of event security, I mean, in the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen rapid advancements in innovation systems, practices for these sort of events. So, is there any new, as mentioned, innovation systems or practices do you think teams will be adopting for this World Cup? Or is there anything on the horizon which you think could move the dial in terms of event security?
I think I'll start quickly. I think we saw it significantly in Qatar, right? I think the ability for the intelligence services to tap into closed circuit television systems, CCTV cameras with facial recognition and track and monitor people the second they leave their hotel room to the second they get back, and everything in between has really changed the game from a security landscape. Obviously, not all nations are as well depth with technology and capability. But I would say further than that, in what really makes a big difference is there may be a chance of a security incident. There's going to be a lot of medical incidents and robust planning in terms of medical capabilities, early intervention, having the capability within your team to react accordingly. I think that's the real risk mitigation here. So when we're looking at security risk, we should be looking at event risk in general from a medical and security perspective, and having someone on the team that can react and immediately. Early intervention is key, so it doesn't lead to long delays and overwhelmed medical facility attendance, etc. I think just from my perspective.
I think that's a really important point as well, that we shouldn't get too hung up on the big picture issues. We've talked about cartel violence, fan violence, that actually even a more basic medical incident is something that should be built into plans. So even if you have a mild medical issue, where the closest appropriate facility is for even basic treatment. I think that's really important that we don't get caught too much in the high level. Sean or Spencer, same question to you.
Yeah, I echo Luke's point there. I think we all plan for the kind of critical security incidents that might occur, but I think the detail and the demand often comes in with the healthcare piece. I think in the States, obviously the price of healthcare insurance has been a conversation that we've had to have to make sure that the correct insurances are in place, because often traveler insurance is a little bit different in North America. So that's something that I think is worth mentioning for this particular occasion. For us, though, I think we're seeing a trend of numerous countries hosting one tournament. I mentioned that before. This is the first one where 3 countries are hosting it. There's the same again in 2030. And what that kind of produces is a very complex, differing intelligence picture. So I think for someone like myself, it takes a lot of reviewing details to kind of sense check what's coming in. So having that single point of contact to review the intelligence and make it relevant for your particular organization is a really important point to reference. So I think the theme of numerous countries hosting tournaments, I think, will continue. We're seeing spiraling costs of hosting Olympics or World Cups, and countries more reluctant to kind of take complete ownership of it. So I think we can continue to see numerous countries hosting a single tournament.
You make a really good point there as well, that if you're just collecting and gathering reams of intelligence, it's really important that it is reviewed and disseminated to people who know what they're going to do with it as well. And very quickly, Spencer, same question to you.
Yeah, I would say Sean nailed it there with that, World Cups and Olympics, they're getting more complex. They're having more hosts. I think that, the lessons learned from this World Cup are going to be very helpful long-term for organizations. So I would suggest that if you're, planning long-term, you make sure that there's lessons you take from this World Cup, because that can help you 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line. You don't want to be looking at it in a vacuum, because at the rate FIFA is, awarding hosting rights, we'll probably see another Canada, US, Mexico World Cup in 20 or so years. So building kind of long-term lessons and long-term sustainability in your organization's security plans is a crucial takeaway from this.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the Q&A section now. I'm very disappointed no one has actually asked any questions about the football itself and England's potential to win the World Cup or anything like that, but I'll park that for now. So we've got a question here which says, Although unlikely that cartels will disrupt the World Cup matches themselves, do you consider Mexican cartels who have direct links to Hamas and Hezbollah may switch to violence to host cities in the US where they have a foothold? Very challenging question, that one. I'll try and give a fairly concise answer. I think it's very important to remember just how much security the host nations are going to be putting behind this World Cup. This happens at every single World Cup where the host nations have a prerogative to make it as safe as possible for both domestic and international fans, because at the end of the day, they're in the spotlight, they're in the international spotlight, and any incidents reflect badly on the host nation and can also have an impact on hosting further events such as the Olympic Games or other major both sporting or entertaining events. So it will very much come down to the monitoring which is being done by the security forces, which obviously is fairly extensive in the US. So there is obviously a chance that Mexican cartels with direct links to Hamas and Hezbollah may switch violence to host cities in the US, but I would be fairly confident in the abilities of the US security forces to both detect and counteract those threats. Spencer, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I would just say that cartel's capabilities are a little bit reduced right now, especially, CJNG, they've lost their leader. I would imagine that they're still more focused on internal dynamics and keeping their footholds in Mexico themselves rather than, launching cross-border operations.
Sure. And cross-border operations for the cartels are obviously historically very challenging themselves. I mean, whilst they're adept at, moving narcotics across the border, being able to move personnel or weaponry or anything like that is obviously a lot more challenging and has a lot more potential red flags that can be detected by the security forces during the planning phase. We've got another question here, which says, do you anticipate a heightened risk of express kidnapping in Mexico during the World Cup? Or is this just a typical amount of risk?
I'll try and tackle that. So I think with all of these events, all of the regular risks tend to increase, right? So you've got the risk of express kidnapping that is latent, that exists currently in its current state. You're going to have opportunity knocking on every door. I think the identification of the fact that there's going to be a lot of foreigners in this location, the fact that many people unknown to most are connected to a cartel in some way, shape, or form plays a role in this. So if you're staying in accommodation, vet that accommodation, make sure there are no links to a cartel. We've seen it with a lot of our clients where they've had employees staying in hotels that were fully operated by a cartel or owned by a cartel, or at least had some dealings with it. And then you've got insiders flagging opportunity to externals, whether that is virtual kidnappings happening from within inside a prison system to express kidnappings or kidnap and ransom situations happening outside hotels, outside venues. Important to note the surveillance phase. So lower your profile, don't draw attention to yourself, be the gray man, blend in, don't, avoid flashpoint locations, and be careful of what information you're disseminating. So don't throw anything in the bin that can be identified or used against you. Don't put your itinerary out there for the world to see. Be careful what you post on social media, etc. So I think mitigation against those risks is very important because they are going to be heightened over the time.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's really important in terms of those basic mitigation measures that are pretty easy for everyone to adopt. Don't be the guy walking around the central square wearing a Rolex and filming everyone on his iPad. Like, that's a good way to get yourself targeted. So that is all we have time for today. So as mentioned at the start, the recording of this webinar will be available, which our marketing team will share with you directly, and that can be shared as widely as you like. If you do need any specific medical or security support during the World Cup, please do not hesitate to reach out to our on-demand team, where you will be greeted by none other by our own Luke Westcott-Taylor or another one of his team. We have also set up a dedicated FIFA information hub, the link to which you will find in the chat, which collates all of our latest intelligence and insights, and we'll be adding to that the closer we get to the World Cup. And then finally, thank you very much to Luke, Spencer, and Sean for joining us today, and we hope you have a lovely rest of your day.